My name is Rachel Hedman, and I have this ancestry of France. My mom's maiden name is Chevalier, meaning knight in knight in shining armor. And so this folk tale is in honor of my ancestry. Way far away from Paris, before Paris is as big as it is now, further back in time, out in the forest, there was a couple named Claude and Jeanette, and they had been married for 57 years. They had grown so long together with each other that they would have wrinkles in the same places, right by their eyes and their chins. They would even start to look more and more like each other as their hair thinned out a bit. And except for Jeanette wearing a skirt, you probably wouldn't know which one was which. They had been together for so long that they didn't even have to say much to each other. Just a single sound, a gasp, a sigh, would be enough, and the other one would know exactly what the other one meant. So one day, when Jeanette was cooking up a nice stew in an iron pot over that fireplace, suddenly from the other room of that cottage, she heard a sound of whew. And she knew that that meant it was getting too warm in their cottage. The stew was done anyway. So Jeanette lifted up her apron and hung on to the edges of that iron pot, lifted it up, and then waddled over to the door, pushed it open with her elbow, and she could feel that cool breeze. But then, right there was a wolf, with its teeth bared, its ears laid back, and Jeanette knew that if she made any movement, any sound, then that wolf would attack. And she held her breath for 10 seconds. She held it for so long that Claude in the other room noticed something was wrong. He peered into the room, and there in the doorway he saw Jeanette and that wolf. The only thing that came to Claude's mind was to yell out, "Pour away, Jeanette! Pour away, Jeanette! Pour away, Jeanette!" Well, Jeanette had never been yelled at by her husband before. And she just stood there until finally the meaning of the words sunk into her brain, and she looked at that bubbling pot of stew, and she poured that stew over the wolf. And soon there was this stench of singed fur. That wolf took off running. And there was still a little bit of stew left at the bottom of that pot so that Claude and Jeanette could have their dinner. But time went on, and suddenly there was another sound. It was when Jeanette walked outside, looked to the edge of the cottage, and what should have been a full length of that cottage wall being filled with firewood was about halfway. And she made the sound of. So Claude heard the sound, knew exactly what he was supposed to do. He put on his cap, he grabbed an axe, he went out into the forest searching for that one big tree that he could chop down. Because then, instead of a lot of little ones, he could just be done with it. And finally, he found that perfect tree. He raised up that axe, and he chopped until he could hear the tree moan and groan. But when he listened closer, it wasn't the tree after all. Off in the distance, he could see a pack of wolves. And one of the wolves was that scalded wolf. He didn't want to be caught within their fangs. He threw down that axe. He climbed up the tree that he was starting to chop down so it swayed a bit. Finally, he was up high. The wolves approached, and they circled about the trunk of that tree. The scalded wolf barked and howled, as if giving orders to the other wolves. And soon that scalded wolf planted all 4 of his paws into the ground. Then another wolf climbed on top of the scalded wolf, and another wolf climbed on top of that one, until Claude knew that any moment fangs would be sunk deep into his ankles, and he would not see his Jeanette. Oh, and suddenly that image of his Jeanette being out there in the cottage, and that's when he thought of something. And he yelled out as loud as he could, "Pour away, Jeanette! Pour away, Jeanette! Pour away, Jeanette!" Well, that scalded wolf had heard those words before and knew what happened next and didn't want to stick around, so it took off running. But without that scalded wolf at the bottom, all the other wolves tumbled down and they started to whimper and to whine and howl, and they took off running deeper into the woods after that scalded wolf. When everything was clear, Claude climbed down that tree. He finished chopping down the tree, brought home the wood. Safe once more. But more time passed. And this time, Jeanette walked down into their cellar, and she saw that there were some empty spaces of where some preserves and jams should be. And she made the sound of, Well, Claude heard it. He knew what it meant. It was time for him to put that cap on, get a nice sack of gold tied onto his belt, and walk the long distance up and over hills, through meadows, till finally he'd make it to the marketplace. He could hear the buzzing of that marketplace. He was almost there, going through the alleyways, when suddenly he felt something press against his back, and then the voice of, "Give me all your money." He didn't turn around. He untied the string that held that sack of gold. He handed it back to that thief. Then that thief forced Claude to climb into a barrel, that he was not to leave that barrel until he no longer heard footsteps. So Claude waited, and he waited. But as he waited, he no longer heard footsteps, but he heard sniffing. And he looked all about this barrel until he saw that there was a hole in this barrel about the size of his fist. And when he looked out, he saw that on the other side was that scalded wolf. The scalded wolf had not discovered Claude yet, and he didn't want to give the wolf time. And so, just like that, Claude threw out his hand, grabbed the wolf's tail, and yelled out as loud as he could, "Pour away, Jeanette! Pour away, Jeanette! Pour away, Jeanette!" Well, that wolf, its fur went on end. It took off running, just bumping that barrel behind it, because Claude still clung onto that tail. And bump, 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 Claude was tumbling through the marketplace. And bump, 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 Claude was tumbling through the meadows. And bump, 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 Claude was tumbling through those hills, until through that hole, Claude could see his cottage. He let go of that wolf's tail. And to this day, that wolf is probably still running. Never was seen from again by Claude and Jeanette. But when Jeanette welcomed Claude at that doorway of the cottage, she looked at where that sack of gold was supposed to be hanging on his belt. And she made a sound of, And Claude made the sound of, That was all he needed to say. And the most wonderful sound was shared that night. The two hearts of theirs beating together. They were alive. They were together. They were still in love.